Lee asked me to do this keynote a couple months ago, and I asked him what he wanted me to talk about, and he said he wanted me to introduce Agile, to kind of explain what Agile's all about, but not to give a typical, here's Agile, here's a this, here's a that. Introduce it in a little bit more informative way, because we are certainly going to have people who already know what Agile is about. And so I want to introduce the concepts behind Agile, the concepts underlie it, the advantages to it. So there's going to be a different way of doing it, though. I want to do it by describing what I would consider the sins of project management, ways that we can go wrong on project management. A lot of different Agile processes, though. There's the ones listed up here, the ones that I would consider Agile in the top box there. We've got extreme programming and Scrum, very similar to each other, a few differences. We've got Crystal, a family of processes, another one called DSDM, Lean, kind of an approach, not necessarily a process on its own. My favorite, unbranded Agile, which is just kind of taking the best of these things, combining them in a way that makes sense for you, getting rid of all the brands, my preference. And then we've got some that I would consider semi-Agile processes. Don't want to get into a lot of debate about why I wouldn't consider them Agile. The biggest reason for me, the one reason that I would consider them semi-Agile, is that they don't rely on self-organizing teams. Self-organization is a fundamental principle to Agile, and these processes, actually, some of them great processes, and I've seen all of them work, actually seen them work more often than I've seen them fail, the bottom ones. So I do like those processes, but I wouldn't go as far as to say they're Agile. Just wanted to put that up there. In terms of kind of getting started, before we get to the what the sins are of project management and how those help us, I want to just kind of zoom in on Scrum for a minute. Describe what Scrum is just for 2 slides, so we have a starting point. Then I'm going to jump into the sins of project management and how Agile helps address and resolve those. Through the way, I'm going to pull in some case study data, show some examples of teams that improved in terms of going faster, teams that got much higher quality as a result of being Agile. So Scrum, one of the things I like about Scrum, no engineering practices prescribed. I find it difficult to introduce an Agile process to an organization and say, hey, we want you to be Agile, we trust you to solve the problem, right? You're smart, we trust you, go figure out how to solve this business problem. By the way, you have to do it exactly this way, and then prescribe a bunch of specific engineering practices or other things. So I want the process to be kind of as lightweight as possible, just a framework. Scrum fits that bill. So one of the nice things about it, no specific engineering practices. Scrum teams use what they call sprints. A sprint is the same as what most of us would call an iteration. I met one client about 2 years ago. I was in a meeting with them, and they're talking about, in a sprint we do this and that. And 10 minutes later somebody would say, in an iteration we do such and such. This went on, it's meeting for about an hour. Finally somebody said, well, when we're in a sprint we do this, but when we're in an iteration we do that. And I got very confused. I kind of perked up from the meeting, and it was like most meetings, I'm starting to doze off. And I said, wait, sprints and iterations are the same thing. What are you talking about? And they said, oh, no, they're completely different here. What's the difference? I said, well, in a sprint, we're working overtime. In an iteration, we're doing the sustainable pace thing, trying to work at a long-term sustainable pace. I was, interesting. I mean, I could totally buy that as a distinction. And I said, well, how long have you been sprinting? How many of them have you done? And they said, well, we're in 8 months of sprinting. So I'll use both terms today. Sprint and iteration, same thing. Fundamental to Scrum, self-organizing cross-functional teams. Scrum gets its name from play in rugby, European sport. Ball is put back in play. The way it's put back in play comes from having some of the bigger players on the team with their arms around each other, pushing against the other team. That's meant to represent the cross-functional team. If you look at there's 5 books out now on Scrum, 3 in English, 2 in German. They're all small. I think every one of them is under 200 pages. One of the reasons for this is that there's not a lot of rules to Scrum. There's a lot of, in any of Agile really, there's a lot of kind of behaviors and techniques and principles and values, not a lot of rules. The few rules that we have tend to be what we call generative rules. Rules that we put in place to generate the right behavior. For example, Scrum will have a daily meeting. We ask teams to get together and talk once a day. And we recommend 3 questions that they do. I don't really care if they got together and ask those 3 questions or 3 different questions. Those 3 questions happen to be ones that we found that generate the right type of behavior on teams. They get the discussion at the right level, not too high, not too deep. So generative rules to create the behavior we want rather than a big lengthy rule book like we might find in a more prescriptive process. In Agile, in Scrum, we're going to have a set of players that looks like this. We're going to have a team. This is not meant to be a hiring list, just a representative list of the team members. We're going to have somebody called a Scrum Master. Other processes or companies might call this an iteration manager. They might call it a coach or Agile coach. This person's there to enforce the process, the values of the process, not the, did you ask the right 3 questions, right? Team can deviate from that, but are they following the values of the process? We're going to, and I've got up there the metaphor that they're a sheepdog. We use that in the Scrum community to represent the idea that the Scrum Master or coach is there to protect the team. One person the Scrum Master often protects the team from is somebody called a product owner. Product owners are on the business side. They're always pushing for more. That's a good thing. I want them pushing their teams for more. A good Scrum Master can look at that and say, hey, product owner, back off. The team's a little burnt out. I see them making a few mistakes. Back off a little bit for a couple weeks. Let the team kind of catch its breath. Also a good Scrum Master, though, might say, hey, product owner, while the team's not listening, let me tell you, now's a good time to push them, right? They're feeling pretty recovered. I think this team is ready for more. Push them a little bit harder, right? So we got this kind of partnership between the Scrum Master and the product owner looking at the process and one looking at the product. Last slide kind of showing what Scrum's about, then we're going to dive into these sins, just to get this started. So on a Scrum process, we have a thing called a product backlog over here on the left side of these screens. This is from a kind of a hypothetical e-commerce site. We will say we've got an e-commerce site up. We want to add 3 features to it. This is our product backlog, prioritized by our product owner. The team works in a series of sprints. They tend to be 2 to 4 weeks long. Those are the most common links. At the start of each sprint, the team gets together, figures out what are we going to build. And they look at the prioritized backlog, they pull one item off that backlog, maybe multiple. For my graphics, my limited graphic abilities, I just want to pull off one item. So the team says, we're going to work on returns this sprint. Right? They select that based on the product owner's priorities. They then determine what they can do by looking at it in task level. So let's take these items, break them into tasks, and figure out what we can commit to. And the team decides this sprint, we can do this one task, this one feature, returns. We'll break it down into 5 items. Code this, test this, automate this, validate the other. They create tasks like that, and they make their commitment. At the end of the sprint, they try to come out with some working software. Something potentially shippable, not truly shippable in all cases, but done, something that's finished. One of the things that appealed to me about Scrum, it's got a 2-faced approach to change. No change inside the sprint. Nothing allowed to change inside that sprint. However, the whole world can change outside the sprint. Here we're showing coupons. We've decided to offer $20 off coupons, 10% off coupons, things like that. Product owner adjusts the priorities on the backlog, moves these around, puts coupons in the proper place. Last element to add up here, once a day the team gets together, synchronizes their work. This is not meant to be a status meeting. This is not a meeting for the manager, Scrum Master, coach, or iteration manager. This is the team getting together and talking about it. I suspect many of you, even if you're not on Agile teams, have done that meeting. I'll touch on that more a little bit later. Here are the sins that I want to talk about today. I want to talk about the sin of gluttony, and we'll see what that is. I want to talk about my favorite, being in Vegas, going to open space and hooking up with people. Okay. We'll talk about sloth. We'll talk about opaqueness, right? Oh, that's a sin. The sin of pride, the sin of wastefulness, and of myopia. So we'll talk about those 7 sins. Let's look at our first one here. The first sin is gluttony. I probably should have taken a picture of the buffet at the restaurant in the hotel here too, instead of this big hamburger. Gluttony refers to trying to get too much, right? Fixing all the dimensions of the project, saying, I want all of this, I want it by this date, right? And of course I need a high quality level, right? When we act as gluttons on our project, this leads to schedules that we're not going to make. It leads to the death marches, the 8 months of sprinting, the 8 months of overtime. Right? We end up cutting quality. Right? Project Management Institute draws something they call the iron triangle. You've all seen this, I'm sure. We've got scope, schedule, and resources on the sides of the triangle, with the idea here you hear this described different ways. You go to your customer and you say, pick 2, right? Or you can't lock down all 3, choose any 2 parameters, and I can make the project successful by fiddling with the 3rd dimension. Well, one of the questions that Agile tries to address is, which dimension is the best one to fiddle with, right? By the way, we've got quality in the middle because quality is of course fixed. We don't ever fiddle with quality, right? Never see that happen. So what about resources? Is resources a good lever to pull on to achieve success? Suppose we're heading towards the end of a project and we're not going to make it. We're going to be late. We can't deliver everything on time. Well, one way to possibly meet that deadline with that set of features, add more people. Well, very unpredictable, right? It might work, it might not. There's the whole mythical man-month concept. There's Brooks's law. Adding people to a late project only makes it later. Right? So even if we thought this was a good idea, it's very risky. Might work, might not. Might be a horrible thing to do. What about schedule? We can pull on the schedule lever. We're headed towards the end of a project and the team says, if we just had a few more weeks, we'd be okay. Technical perspective, it's a pretty good solution. A couple more weeks, a little more work, we're done. From a business side, maybe not such a good idea. Right? We've got marketing commitments, we've lined up trainers to go train our user base, all sorts of reasons why schedule may be a bad lever to pull on. Scope, from a technical perspective, pretty good. Right? Drop some features. From the business side, maybe not so bad, as long as the team, 2 things are true. The team has worked in priority order, and as long as the team did their best work. As long as the team wasn't off screwing around or doing bad things, as long as they worked in priority order, scope, not such a bad thing to drop. So on Agile projects, we favor scope management. We do this in a number of different ways. One of the ways we do it is through time boxes. Time boxes help teams avoid gluttony, right? We treat the iteration or the sprint length as fixed. We say, here's what we're going to get done. Now we may float the number of iterations that we're going to run. We start out thinking maybe we'll be done in 8 2-week iterations. We get partway and realize maybe it's going to take us 9 or 10. Right? We treat these iterations often as budgets. Right? I have 2 iterations to get enough functionality in to make coupons a valid feature. That's our budget. I know I can get at least something credible in 2 sprints, and we work in priority order. At the end of 2 sprints, we're done with coupons, we move on to the next thing. This helps us avoid grabbing too much. Time boxes also help us with predictability. Over time, a team is able to figure out how much they will complete. We call this velocity. It's really kind of their pace per iteration. There's a real team up there, 9 sprints. You'll notice that velocity is volatile. It's not consistent. I used to try to make this point by tossing up a graph of a team's last 82 sprints and showing the volatility over those 82 sprints. The team I tossed up was the Chicago Bulls back when Michael Jordan was with them, right? They call their sprints games, right? But that was a very representative graph of what a team might get. Right? Volatility in velocity is normal. It's part of what we would expect. So we're going to look at things like average velocities and such. Let me show you one way that this helps us avoid gluttony. Suppose we've got a project that has planned something like this. We've planned to do those first 4 features in the first sprint or iteration, the next 4 in the next iteration, and we've got some estimates that go with these. These might be in what an Agile team would call story points, maybe ideal days. They're just a relative size for now, is all we need to know for today. We've estimated those. This team would have a planned velocity of 16. If you look at those numbers, we've got a 5, 3, 5, 3 in the top. That adds to 16. This team has a planned velocity of 16. They run their first sprint, though, and when they run that first sprint, they end up doing this. They only get the first 3 done in that sprint. They have an observed velocity of 13. This team has to set some expectation going forward of what their velocity is going to be. They've got to be communicating out to bosses and customers and clients where they think they'll finish. So think about for a moment what you think their likely going forward velocity is going to be. Well, one argument might be 16. That's what we've done historically. Right? Something told us to set up 16 as our velocity in that plan on the left, so let's go with 16. Right? Valid argument for that. Maybe that's our average over the last 10 years. On the other hand, maybe 13 is the right answer. This is called yesterday's weather. Let's plan on this iteration getting done what we got done last iteration. Right? Valid argument for that. So there's a valid argument for 16, there's a valid argument for 13. I don't know which is right. I'd have to be in the context of this project. What about the argument for 19? We have to get back on track. Is that a good answer? Which one do we tend to choose on traditional projects? Right? I think we often tend to choose 19. Got to get back on track. Right? Looking at it this way, looking at it with these velocities, and when a boss comes to you and says, you guys got to get back on track, or worse, when we're tempted to assume that ourselves, oh, we'll get back on track, we learned a lot. We have something that told us to use 16, past history. We just experienced a 13. There's no logic in choosing 19 as a going forward velocity. By all means, try to achieve 19. Try to get back on track. I am not saying not to. Right? Do try to get back on track. But when you have to set expectations with people, they better be somewhere between 13 and 16. 19 would not be a realistic number. That would be deceiving our customers. Now, I've got two choices when we get down all the way to K and L. I can drop those, or I can extend the release. I can do a fourth sprint. Right? There'd be a choice that the team would have to make. Let's go on to our second sin. Second sin is lust. Lust is an intense or unrestrained craving for features. More, right? And it comes from trying to pull in too many features, right, during the time that we allowed. It comes from those, we see this on those projects where we'll have 95% mandatory features, right? This leads to kind of violating that sustainable pace principle that we're after. Leads to dropping quality then, either intentionally, we got to get more in, or unintentionally because we're working too fast. And it leads to surprises, right? How many bosses have you met in your life? The first day on the job, you meet with your boss, and your boss says, my primary rule is no surprises, right? I think every boss I've ever had told me something like that, right? I don't want to be surprised, right? That's a common thing. Lust leads to this. Now, I've got three ways I want to touch on that Agile deals with lust. The first, we focus on working in priority order, right? Even if everything is required, even if we have a product owner that says, I need it all. It's like a car. I can't have a car without four wheels and an engine and everything else. I need it all. Even if we work with a product owner like that, an Agile team has to work in order, right? They take one item off the product backlog, they take the second, they take the third, right? So there's an implicit, to some level, forced ranking of the items. Okay, you need it all, Mr. Product Owner. Which one should I do first? And the team grabs the first 4 or 5, runs a sprint. So this helps us deal with lust. Second way that we deal with lust, our lusts are incrementally gratified. Right? Every 2 to 4 weeks, we're seeing some software come out. This avoids letting lust accumulate. Right? It's kind of like a release for our lust. Getting the opportunity, customers who get to see software every couple of weeks, very beneficial. I used to have this theory before I got Agile, before I started doing Agile. I've always been pretty close to it, but before I really started to do it, I used to have this feeling that it took 2 to 3 releases for a development organization to be trusted by its customers. And I was thinking this kind of in an internal environment. That's where I worked a lot in the late 80s. And I always felt like my customers needed to see me put out a release 1, then they needed to give me feedback, and I would do a release 2, and then I'd do a release 3, and then they would trust there'll be more releases, and this team will give us good software. Now, that was back in the era when those releases were 6, 9, 12 months long. I mean, it took 2.5 years for the customer organization to start to trust my development organization. Well, in Agile, I think it still takes 2 or 3 deliveries. I don't want to call them releases. But that can happen in as short as 2 or 3 sprints now, right? You hire me to write something, I write something and give it to you in 2 weeks. I do another one, I give it to you in 2 weeks. I do you one more, 2 weeks later, you start to trust, there's going to be more, and you start to have this feeling. So lust doesn't build up. I mentioned sustainable pace, so let's look at it a little bit more. Big part of Agile is working at a sustainable pace. We asked how many Europeans we had here, or at least outside the US. And I remember Kent Beck telling a story about how when he wrote about this initially and went over to Europe to speak about it, he called it the 40-hour work week. And he went over to Europe and started talking about the 40-hour work week as though it was meant to be a good thing, right? Which it would be here. And he said, the Europeans got mad, right? Why do I have to work overtime just to be Agile, right? A lot of the 37.5-hour work weeks and things like that. So we Kent changed this and refers to it now as sustainable pace. The idea here being that a team should work at a pace that they can maintain over the long term, right? Little sprints, that's a bad term, but little bursts of extra activity may not be a useful thing. And I love this quote from Kent's second book, his second extreme programming book, where he says, overtime is a symptom of a serious problem. And it basically goes on to say, if you've got a problem that you can solve with 1 week of overtime, go ahead, right? Sustainable pace doesn't mean 40 hours every week. It doesn't mean 37 and a half hours every week. Go watch a 10K this weekend. Go watch some runners do a 10K. Stand at the finish line. You'll see what a sustainable pace is. They speed up over the finish line, right? Edge out the person next to you, beat your friend that you think's about 30 seconds behind, catch up with that one runner ahead of you. That's not sustainable. It's the last 200 yards, right? And people sprint across the end. So sustainable pace doesn't mean exactly 40 every time. Kent says do it one time. Solve that problem. But if you come back next week and think you need to do it again, you got a big problem. I've got this graphic of this Scrum candy bar with less crunch down there, right? Less crunch, less overtime. Because one of my clients, the High Moon Studios, learned this the hard way. They're a video game developer. Video game industry is one of the few industries that has the great big industry trade show still, right? Where everybody has to go and show off their software for the last year. And old habits die hard, right? It used to be that when the trade show would come up, everybody would go into overtime mode for the couple months preceding the show. You wanted your publisher to like it, you wanted to start getting good press, you'd put in a lot of overtime. So here's a slide showing how High Moon learned what overtime does. This was their normal velocity, this was their normal pace. And I could have drawn this out over the last dozen or so sprints. This was their average velocity over the previous dozen or so sprints. This team's running one week sprints at this time. They decided, trade show coming up, everybody better work some overtime. They put in some mandatory overtime, and of course velocity went up. They were getting more done. Let's keep at it, let's do overtime again. Second sprint with overtime, they saw this. A little bit ahead still, but notice the big drop, right? Probably not worth making people work extra just to get that. But we got some big benefit that first week, let's do it again. Mandated overtime again. Well, now we're getting screwed, let's keep doing it. Right? What happened here, this is all very objective, this was measurable. If you talk to the CTO of this company, again, it was Clinton Keith, good friend of mine. If you talk to Clinton, his theory about what happened here is the team did get more done that first week, absolutely got more done. By the second week, they're starting to get a little more tired, a little more sloppy. Some sloppiness crept into things, and that sloppiness came back to hurt them in the third and fourth weeks, right? So this to me is evidence that Kent Beck's suggestion, 1 week overtime, go ahead, right? Now, I don't know, I might be willing to extend that. Hey, you got to work overtime 2 weeks, go ahead, I think most people can handle that. But if you're looking at it as a chronic situation, 8 months, the story I started with today, it's not going to help, right? This is the type of thing that I could put up 8 different companies showing you this. You still don't internalize it until you live through it, right? Until this is your data, this is really hard. This is why the old habits die hard. Clinton Keith, that led this company through this, he knew that overtime wasn't a great thing to do. It's still a temptation, and it's free to try, right, in most companies. So we try it, and here's what we see. Third sin is sloth. Most of you have seen this graphic, the roadkill paved over here or painted over. The idea with sloth is it's kind of losing the focus on doing high quality work. This is often manifests itself as testing quality in at the end, right? Or not needing to do quality, or not needing to do any testing. Most of us have worked in the environment where the boss said we don't need testers, just hire better programmers, things like that, right? I worked in one of those. This leads to big delays, unpredictable schedules, variability in the team's velocity shows up. If we have low quality work, we will see the velocity be very volatile in teams. And I've graphed that with some teams before. I just want to give you one anecdote of a team where I saw this. My company was in the process of acquiring another company. And I went out to do due diligence on the technical side with the company. And as I met the development staff, I was mostly talking to them, they kept using a phrase that I found interesting, because I'd asked them about quality. It's a big concern of mine. If we're going to buy them, we're going to inherit their code base. I want to know if it's any good. And I kept asking about quality and test practices. And every time I did, they used a phrase that kind of threw me for a loop. They kept saying, quality is baked into our process. And that sounds pretty good, right? Quality is fundamental. Quality is baked into what we do. And after about the 8th guy said that over the course of the day that I was there, like 8-hour day, after about the 7th or 8th person who said this, I finally had to say, stop. What does quality is baked in mean? I'm not getting this. And everybody uses this phrase. Where does that come from? And the one guy came clean, because I think he knew that if we went with the acquisition, I'd end up being his boss, and he certainly didn't want to lie to me. And he came clean with it and about what it meant. Quality is baked in was a phrase that came from their CEO, and it was basically the excuse to not hire testers. We will bake quality into the process. We will write good code as we go. We don't need any testing at the end. So this team did no testing whatsoever at the end, and we ended up not acquiring them. So Agile takes quality very seriously. Here are some of the, I should have changed the top of that slide to say XP practices. These are really XP practices. And one of the nice things with XP being extreme, it's often out there in the forefront of new ideas. And being on the forefront is extreme and risky and things like that. But it's great because we get these extreme programming teams out there trying all sorts of new things, and then the rest of us can kind of pull them into our projects. So these are really XP practices more than Agile. I want to give XP the credit for coming up with these ideas. But then we've pulled these into most Agile teams. Simple design, right? Trying to keep it simple, not getting too elaborate. No more complex than it needs to be. Huge focus on automated testing. I love this part of it. Test-driven development. Writing a little bit of a test before you write some code. I love doing test-driven development. I'm such a total geek. My Christmas present to myself this year was 4 hours of uninterrupted programming time on Christmas Day in my home office, right? And my wife agreed that would be her Christmas present to me, was to let me program for 4 hours uninterrupted. And I'm working on a little project for my daughters who are on a age group swim team. And I'm writing some new features for their website. And I'm doing it in Ruby on Rails. Not a language I'm really great with. I'm pretty good at it. I've been doing it for a few years now, but not great with it. Because I've just learned it by kind of diving in, not going through a bunch of classes or real systematic study, just kind of diving in and writing code. And I write everything test-driven. And it's Christmas Day, it's mid-afternoon, I'm writing some code, and I get to a part that I don't know how to test first. And I think about it, and then I looked around the room, my home office, to make sure nobody would see me write code first. And I cheated, I wrote the code, then I went back and wrote the test after, but my 8-year-old daughter was gonna walk in and say, Dad, red, green, refactor, you can't do it that way. Continuous integration, right? Always having a build server watching the code that gets checked in. If we break something, find out about it now. I look back and I laugh at how I used to do this and think we were pretty good. We used to integrate once a week. Everything from all 20 programmers would get integrated once a week. And that was so wonderful back in 91 compared to how we did it before. That was wonderful. I don't know why we never thought, hey, if integrating once a week is so much better than doing it randomly, why don't we do it once a day or once an hour? I don't know why we didn't ever think of that. I'm kind of ashamed I didn't. Pair programming. I invented pair programming, by the way. I know that the XP community thinks they did, but I did. It was 1986. I got hired by Anderson Consulting, and day one on the job, they had me fill out a skills assessment. And it said, how good are you at C? And I was a rank beginner, a barely beginner. And I said, oh, intermediate. By the time this big company reads this thing, I will be intermediate. I'm enthused about this language. This language was the first one that I started to learn that fit how my brain worked. Fortran and others didn't fit. C fit with my brain. So I'm going to learn this. And by the time they read it, I will be intermediate. They read it the next day. That was Tuesday. On Wednesday, they had me fly to New York from LA, where I lived, to New York. And they put me on a project in New York. And I was there to write C code. Fortunately, there was another developer that had been in the same situation. Third day with the company, they'd flown him in to New York. And I talked to him and I said, Chris, I got to come clean. I lied. I'm a beginner. And Chris said, oh shit, I lied too. We decided that by pairing up, they wouldn't know which one of us to fire, right? He and I paired there for the next 4 years. I left, I went to Sacramento, California, and started a company there and brought him there. He and I paired there for 4 years. So we paired from 86 to 94 most days. Guy ended up being a good friend of mine, my best man at my wedding and things like that, all from pair programming. Refactoring, Agile teams go in and clean up code. I grew up as a Boy Scout, right? And Boy Scouts always learn that, leave the trail cleaner than you found it. This is part of what refactoring is about. We coach teams, when you go in, if you see things that aren't perfect, if they aren't good, go and just leave it a little bit better, right? If everybody does that, things improve. I want to show you a company that did this. This company, can't use their real name, so I'll call them Cosmodemonic Biotech. Any Henry Miller fans will catch that reference. They had an existing product that had been built. It was 3,000 use cases to build the product, and it took them 9 months to do with a total of 540 person months. Not a huge project, very rushed, very complex domain too. This is a biotech domain, very complex. An average of 120 lines of code per month. Now, I'm not a huge fan of lines of code. We know if we set this up as a, whichever programmer writes the most lines of code gets a bonus. We know that's a bad idea. But in hindsight, measuring a team that wasn't measured at the time, I think it's probably a credible metric. So 120 lines of code per person per month. This company got into a situation where they were essentially acquired, but the product was acquired and was assigned to a new staff to write a completely different version of the product because the waterfall version had failed. So a new team wrote the same product. So this was a chance to compare different products with different staff. This product I got to run, and I did it with Scrum. We had 1,400 user stories, fairly large project. Took 12 months. It took longer on the calendar, but we did it with a much smaller staff. I don't think there were ever more than 6 people on it. It was 54 person months, which is conveniently, I can do in my head, 1/10 the number of person months. A little bit smaller. I would take that to probably be a good sign because it actually did much more, and it worked. The previous one didn't. With a productivity of almost 7 times more, or I guess 7 times more. So very successful. This team did this by focusing on quality. This team had, I should have put the number of test lines up here, but I don't know it for the waterfall team. This team had more than 51,000 lines of test code. They had more test code than they had production code, and this is what allowed them to go as fast. So dealing with the sloth sin. The second one, this company here, we mentioned Lisa Crispin, who's here, an author of a wonderful book, Testing XP, and a new book coming out, I guess, towards the end of the year. This is her company. So stop by and talk to her. She can tell you more about this one. Wonderful success here. This company had a product that was kind of struggling. This is way before Lisa was here. I'm not going to blame her for that. She came in and helped solve these problems. And the company had to get good at Agile to do this. And they had to improve their quality. They were having production issues daily. They got to the point where maybe a production issue once a month coming in. So I looked back at what the team had done. And again, this team was not measured in terms of lines of code or anything during the time. So I think it's a valid measure in hindsight. US average that I dug up at the time was 270 lines of code per person per month. This team had gone fairly quickly before that. They'd averaged 389. But they did that by being very sloppy. I mean, this is a buggy system initially. This team, 9 months after they started Agile, I measured what they had done. And they were about a little over 3 times faster than they had gone before. That was pretty impressive because certainly in the first month they weren't any faster, right? So by the 9th month they were going a whole lot faster. Here is what they did in quality. In the 3 years prior to starting with Agile, they were having 10 defects per 1,000 lines of code. Pretty high. In the first 9 months after they started, they had 2.9 defects per 1,000 lines of code. Still kind of moderately high, but there was no big rewrite of the old system. I didn't have a way to go back in and see how many of those defects were reported against the old code versus the new, but I'm going to guess 80 to 90% were still against the old code. But that old code had been gradually improved as the team went in, refactored things going through the system. But it's even better. They did this without a targeted rewrite. This improved just by the refactoring, leaving the code cleaner than they found it. And if we'd measured the, if I'd measured the new and the old code, it would be even better. I'd have a better number to put up there. That's sin number 3. sloth. Sin number 4, opaqueness. Right? Obscuring the progress, quality, or other attribute. This to me is about not knowing where we're really at. This is one of the biggest benefits that I see to Agile that bosses report to me, right? A executive in a company or a product manager in a company. This is the part of Agile that they love, that there's no longer this opaqueness to the project. They get to see where they're really at, right? See how Agile deals with opaqueness. So I want to talk about a couple types of opaqueness, the first being quality opaqueness. With quality opaqueness, we don't really know where we're at in terms of the bug count and the quality of our system. This is another place where Timeboxes help us, right? At the end of every sprint, we're supposed to be potentially shippable. If at the end of that sprint or iteration we're not potentially shippable, it's a real bad sign. We better fix that problem. So we don't get to the end of a traditional project. We go for 9 months and we're going to have the 3-month testing phase. But we have no idea if that's the right amount of time. Maybe the team wrote high quality code, maybe they didn't. Right? Well, with an Agile project, we don't let that build up. We can avoid the 90% syndrome. Things are done or not done. No debate about it as we go through. How we handle with schedule opaqueness is this. Some of you may have seen a chart like this before. This is what's called a release burndown chart. A release burndown chart shows the amount of work that the team is doing per iteration. So this team here is a real team. Plan to do 360 what we're going to call story points, just a measure of the size of each of the items on their product backlog. 360 story points over 4 sprints. They had a planned velocity of 90. They were going to do 90 points per sprint. They run the first sprint and they see that. By the way, let me back up. This is their hypothetical line. Right, this is the hypothetical, this is not the reality. I'm going to add on the real line here in a moment. I draw the hypothetical line so that we can look at this. In reality, I don't normally draw this line. But I've drawn it today so I can put up their observed velocity and I can ask, are they ahead or behind? So look at that for a second. Notice they're behind schedule. They expected to be down to that light blue line. They're at the diamond instead, tiny bit behind. CEO is guiding adoption of Scrum into her company. She'd read an article about it somewhere, it's just fairly technical, and she hired me to come train her team and get them successful. Small company, about 100 people. Not all in development. Development is 20 or something. 4 sprints. I have to meet with her at the end of the first sprint. We don't have anything useful to say. It's 1 data point. Right? I wish we were a little ahead instead of a little behind, but 1 data point, no big deal. We ran the second sprint. What do you think we talked about there? Right. Linda, did you say firing me? Was that? No? Oh, okay. No, we didn't talk about firing me, and Linda didn't say that. We talked about what now, right? I drew the trend line through here. It was 6.1 sprints. And the CEO said, I can't wait 6 sprints. I said, well, I got bad news for you. In Agile, we round up. It'll be 7 sprints. So there's no way I'm waiting 7 sprints. We told the salespeople they'd have it in 4. Well, what are we going to do? Well, we could drop some work, right? Look at how much we'd have to drop there. We'd have to drop a lot, right? We wouldn't have to drop just down to the blue line. We'd have to drop below. She said, I can't do that. I said, well, could you drop a little bit? I think the first sprint was pretty representative. Second sprint, second iteration, a little bit of bad luck. We're not going to have that again, I don't think. I think our true velocity will be closer to that first sprint. So if we dropped a little bit, maybe we could be done in 5. She said, I could drop a little bit. I never believe it when somebody says that, so I said, show me. Which ones are on the chopping block? I want to know which items. And she did. Okay, let's plan on 5 sprints. Let's not drop anything, but let's plan on 5 sprints. We ran the third sprint. Here I went and asked for a big raise. Right? No. Just like I shouldn't have been fired after the second, I shouldn't ask for a big raise after the third sprint. Notice the first and third balance out. Random noise. Right? Second sprint, some bad luck. Here, CEO and I talked about how we may want to go in 4 sprints. 1 more sprint like this third one, we'll be done in 4. We'd only have to drop a little bit. She said, no, I'm not going to tell people it's coming in 4. We've already told them 5. All right? If I tell them 4, I know it'll be late, it'll be 5. So let's just stick with 5. 5 looks very safe. We ran a 4th sprint. Kind of looks like Parkinson's law took hold here, right? Work expands to fill the time available. No, it didn't. The team continued at the pace of number 3. But then they said, we're not going to do a sprint with that much. Let's add some work. Let's make it a decent normal sprint. And they added enough work back in. So if you can imagine this line drawn, they drew it down, erased it, added some scope back in, and then redrew the line where it shows on this picture. And we ran the 5th sprint to finish. Right? Now, this is about showing real progress on the team. I work with a lot of execs, and they'll say this is their favorite part of Agile. I work with this one president of a company, and he loves this. He says, sometimes the news isn't good, right? Sometimes it looks like sprint number 2 up there, but I always know where we're at. Right? And he had a VP in a past life that lied to him and always told him, oh, we'll be done in one more month. And he says, you know, they can't lie to me anymore. I know where we're at, and I can deal with it. I can make decisions. Right? Here's scope opaqueness. So we've seen quality schedule, now here's scope opaqueness. This is the same graph we saw earlier, team over 9 sprints. I'm interested in 3 things from this velocity graph. I'm interested in their long-term average, but I'm also interested in their kind of worst case average. How bad might things get, right? I define worst case as take the average of take the worst 3 out of the last 8, right? I don't care what this team was doing back in the Clinton administration, right? It's way too long ago. But what's their average over the last 8 sprints, their worst case? So I'm going to take the worst 3 sprints, average those up. I got to do the same with their best sprints. So let's take their best 3 chosen among the last 8. You can use your own definitions. I don't care how you define these. Depends on how long your teams stay together, depends on how long your sprints are. But something like this that lets you find your long-term average and a best and worst case. I'm after what a statistician would call a confidence interval. Right? But I don't have 100 items. I don't even have 30 or 40 items in most cases to go back and get a truly statistically relevant confidence interval. So I do something like this that gets me close enough that I can at least make decisions with it. Right? Here's how I'm going to use this information. Let's remember these numbers for a moment. We got 28, 33, and 37. Take the 28, your velocity, your low-end velocity, multiply by the number of sprints or iterations. Count down your product backlog, those stacked up index cards there. And say, hey, at our worst case, we'll finish here. Do the same with your average. Do the same with the best case. This lets us make predictions. Right? We'd like to run an ad during the Super Bowl. We'd like to run an ad featuring one of those items at the very bottom. No, it's not going to happen. Right? This lets us look at our backlog and make decisions with it. So use these interpolations of velocity as arrows pointing into your backlog to predict things. I want to show you another visualization of the same type of thing. We saw a Burndown chart. This is a new type of Burndown chart. What I've got going on here is updating the Burndown once per sprint, just like normal, and then then stacking up the product backlog on the right. The product backlog is shown in priority order from top to bottom. The most important thing on our e-commerce site were some mandatory returns features. Once we were done with those, we wanted to work on gift wrapping. And then let's go back and add a little bit of fancy stuff to returns before we go on to exchanges, some shopping cart improvements, something else, and then eventually coupons. So this is our product backlog. Most important at the top, down. So it's kind of flipped over. Right? You'll notice the top work is all done, right? That's where we're at on the Burndown chart, is that sprint 7, the last circle. Right, so I can draw a black line over showing where we're currently at. This tells me what's done. Right? So it's a way of dealing with scope opaqueness, right? I get to show where we're at. I get to draw those 3 lines, the 28, the 33, and the 37, right? Extrapolate, draw some velocity predictions, and say, hey, worst case, we're going to get halfway into the shopping cart features. Right? So if we're worried about, will exchanges be in the product? Right? Can we do exchanges on our website? Yeah, that's going to be safe. We're going to have to go slower than our slowest long-term velocity for that to be at risk. It's a way of drawing conclusions from here. Sin 5, pride. Definition here is thinking that we know everything. I don't need to talk to anybody. I know everything that needs to be in this product. This leads to leaving out stakeholders and other types of users. Results in a failure to learn. Right? Thinking that I know everything means that I don't learn anymore. Here's the Scrum diagram again, right? We saw this before. Think about all the opportunities to solicit feedback here, right? Pretty much throw a dart and you can hit an opportunity to solicit feedback, right? One of the places that I didn't even mention on here, was the Agile retrospective over here on the right, right? At the end of a sprint, the team runs a retrospective, right? In that retrospective, they reflect on how's the process working for us, right? Team does the daily stand-up, opportunity to learn there, get feedback there, right? All during the sprint, we can be showing the software to our product owner, to others getting feedback there. During the sprint planning meeting, all over the place, opportunities for feedback. Feedback leads to learning. Another way to deal with this sin is in how we engage our users, right? I'm a fan of using what we call user stories for our product backlog items. This is one of the Agile books that I've written on user stories. I love this as a technique for engaging users, right? So a couple sample user stories. As a user, I want to reserve a hotel room. As a vacation traveler, I want to see photos of hotel rooms so that I can choose the right one. Now I changed that. The first story says as a user, the second one says as a vacation planner. Right? I'm here for business this week. It's a Palazzo, I'm staying at the Palazzo, it's a nice hotel. Right? But I didn't pick it, I just said, where's the conference? My assistant booked my hotel room. But I'm coming back here in October. Oh, there's a Jimmy Buffett concert you gotta come back for in October. Any parrot heads will know what I'm talking about. And so I'm coming back for a holiday. Then I'll make sure I look at photos of hotel rooms. Right? Where do I want to stay? I'll pick the right room. Make sure I've got a nice room or nice hotel. Much more important on a vacation than a business trip. One more example up here. As a user, I want the site to be available with 5.9 uptime. Right? Just wanted to show a non-functional requirement. Right? User stories can work for non-functional requirements. These engage our users because they can relate to this. Stakeholders can get much more involved in this than they can the system shall this. Nobody likes writing or reading those. Use cases, we might have made them a little too complicated for most users. We take these user stories and progressively refine them. This is a real example from one of my clients, a company called JDA Software. They have a little over 500 people doing Scrum in 2 cities in the US, 1 in India. They sell software to large retailers, marketers. So like Nordstrom's or Walmart or any of those type of places. They had a large user story. As a vice president of marketing, I want to review the performance of historical promotional campaigns. Ads. Where should I put my ad money is what they're trying to figure out. That was a huge user story. That was okay at the start, but as that story gets closer to the time we're going to implement it, we can break it up. And we broke it up into a story about selecting the time frame to use, another story about selecting which type of campaigns to see. I'm only interested in electronic advertising. Right? I'm not interested in print advertising. I have a separate budget for print advertising. Right? We can take these stories, we can make these even smaller if we need to. This engages our users not just at the beginning, but throughout the process. Right? So user stories are a good way for dealing with this sin. Next sin, wastefulness. Misuse of critical resources. Right? Time can be misused, resources can be misused, right? Motivation, right? Team excitement can get misused. Here's 4 ways that Agile deals with waste. I'll toss up one more in a moment. We time box things, right? Again, time boxes can be used as budgets for features. We're not going to let time get away from us because we're going to be able to say, look, this feature is worth 4 weeks. Let's put one 4-week sprint on this feature. We can have something credible for coupons in 4 weeks, and after that we move on. I know we'd like to spend 6, maybe even 8 weeks on it, but in the grand scheme, looking at all the features we'd like to get, it's only worth 4 weeks, and I know we can get at least something in 4 weeks. Time boxing keeps a focus on demonstrable progress. Time boxes help us know that, can let us know if we're building up bug debt, right? Are we not finishing high quality work at the end of sprints? It lets us measure that. The daily stand-ups, right? Anybody remember Fred Brooks's answer in the Mythical Man Month? He was the first project manager to ever be a year late. I remember reading that book when not when it came up, but a little bit afterwards, and he was asked, how can a project be a year late? And he was asked like it was impossible. How can this possibly happen? Yet most of us these days have worked or seen or had a friend work on a project that was a year late, right? Most of us can point to some project that was like that, or most of us run an OS that was a year late. You can't see, but I'm on a Mac. He was asked, how can a project get to be a year late? Anybody remember his answer? 1 day at a time, right? The daily stand-ups help with this. I am firmly convinced of this, and I thought this even before I started doing Scrum, so a long time ago, that projects slip by the frequency with which they meet. So if a project is meeting daily, of course it can be late. But that slip will be measured in days. If a project gets together and does monthly meetings, right, let's do a big monthly meeting and that's all we do. That project might be late, but it'll be measured in months, right? The daily stand-up keeps the focus on things, right? Now I said earlier that I bet that most of you, even if you haven't been on an Agile project, may have done a daily stand-up. Let me explain what I meant by that. You've got 3 weeks left on a project. You're going to be on time. It's been going on for maybe 6 months, 9 months. You've got 3 weeks left. You're going to be on time, as long as everybody stays focused, as long as nothing slips through the cracks. And somebody comes up with a great idea. Somebody says, hey, let's meet every day after lunch outside the boss's office. Or let's get together in my cubicle. There's a lot of space in my cube right after lunch. Let's just talk for 5 or 10 minutes. And you do. And maybe somebody sticks up on the wall a list of things that have to get done. And I come in and say that I'm struggling with something. Somebody help me out. I just can't get the vendor to call me back. Can you call the vendor while I'm trying to get the code fixed? And we just talk about things like that every day, and it feels very energizing, and it keeps the issues very visible. What a great idea. And we finish the project, we ship the project, we start the next project, and we throw that good idea away. Why do that, right? It's a good idea. Keep doing it all the time, even at the beginning. May not be as critical, but it's still very, very helpful. So on Scrum, we do these throughout the project. Iteration retrospectives. Right? At the end of a sprint or iteration, we reflect, we look back, and we see what can we learn from this process. I mentioned it now before I forget about it. Wonderful book on this called Agile Retrospectives. Right? Check that out at the bookstore. I'm sure they'll have that. Wonderful book. Self-organizing teams. Self-organization doesn't mean chaos. It doesn't mean randomness. Right? The first book that talked about Scrum came out in 1990, and it describes the process. Nobody'd done it on a software project yet. The authors are basically saying, wouldn't it be great if somebody did this on a software project instead of a new product development project, like a tangible thing like a Walkman? And so it describes it as very chaotic sounding, and the authors go on to say, but control is absolutely exerted over this team. It says, but it's subtle and indirect. It's in things like, who do you put on the team? How big a challenge do you give the team, right? Do you put the team co-located or spread out? All sorts of things like that. So it's a subtle and indirect control. And I don't mean control in some sort of pejorative manner, right? I'm just trying to point out that self-organization, letting the team solve the problem, does not mean chaos. We still exert some influence over how that team will choose to self-organize. Another way we deal with waste. We keep the intensity up. I've got a good friend named Todd who loves Agile, loves Scrum. Took him a while to get there. Took him a couple years before he really liked it. He does these days, has for a couple years now. But every now and then he'll comment on how he misses the good old analysis phase, where he had no deliverables for 3 months, and he just sat in a room and thought, right? He's an architect, right? And he's half joking. I mean, he's half serious too. He really does miss that phase, because he also does somewhat miss, Todd's, he's like some of us, I'm sure, not like me, but he's the type who really did like the end of a project, where we're living there till 10 o'clock at night, eating pizza and Jolt soda and Mountain Dew and stuff like that. He really does like that part of the project. And this is the kind of intensity variance that we'll see on a waterfall project. Pretty casual, let's go out for the really long lunch today, and hey, we'll make up for it at the end when we're living here. Well, on a Scrum project or Agile project in general, the intensity is going to differ over time. It's going to be more like this, right? A 2-week sprint, yeah, you'll feel a difference. 4-week sprint, a little bit more of a difference. I'm the type of guy, I get on the treadmill at the gym. They get the nice gym here. I go on the treadmill. I set it at one speed. I set it at flat, and I go that speed that time the whole time, right? I don't do the hill route and all that type of stuff, right? I like how Agile spreads these things out. Todd, if I ever saw him on the treadmill, I'm sure he'd be the type sprinting, walking, going up the hill, right? He likes that type of difference. So find the right balance for your team, something that keeps the intensity level where it feels appropriate for the team. I want to show one example of one team that I think has done a great job with this, and how kind of spreading out the intensity level helped them quite a bit. Salesforce.com. These guys did a big bang Agile transition. They converted the whole company overnight. They called me up in October of '06, and said, hi, we're Salesforce. We just converted 250 people to Scrum yesterday. Can you help? And I said, oh, come on, this is one of my friends playing a joke on me. Who is this? You know, a consultant dreams of somebody calling up and saying, yeah, we got 250 people overnight. And they said, no, we're serious. I said, okay, well, you don't need me, you need a shrink if you converted 250 people overnight. Here's some statistics from what they saw, right? 61% faster to major releases with almost twice as much functionality, right? Real simple metric, the third one, number of features per developer. Yeah, of course, features were of all different sizes, right? But developers were of all different skills too. Just a real simple metric, but it tells something helpful. Increase in major release cumulative value. This is an interesting metric that needs a moment of explanation. What they did here is they tracked how long each feature was available to customers in the year. So a feature delivered in January was more valuable than a feature delivered in December, right? How long did customers have the features that they got? And based on that, they had tremendous increase in value. The last sin, myopia. Not seeing beyond the current work, what you're involved in. We see this in teams that don't see the big picture, and we see this in individuals who get tied, here's my role, I only do my thing. This leads to unsuccessful projects and delays. Well, in Agile, we plan at different levels. We make release plans. Here's where I want to be in 6 months. Even a team that puts out software every 2 weeks, true software out on a website every 2 weeks, should put together some sort of release plan saying, hey, in 6 months, here's what we want to add up to. Each time we start a new sprint or iteration, we get together and we plan the next 2 to 4 weeks. So we're going to plan at different levels, right? We deal with myopia by having cross-functional teams, right? I mentioned I'm on a Mac today. Steve Jobs was interviewed in Time magazine 2 years ago. And he told an interesting story. He was asked, how can Apple so consistently innovate great products? And you know, think what you want about Apple, not always a successful financial company, although recently quite a bit, very innovative, and most people will grant them that. Very innovative company. And he was asked, how can Apple so consistently innovate great products? His answer was interesting. He answered in the form of a story. He said, think about a car company. Car company comes out with a new car design. They show it off at the car show. People look at it and go, ooh, beautiful car. And Ford takes that feedback back to Dearborn, Michigan, and they tell the engineers, build this car. People loved the design. And the engineers look at it and say, oh, it's obvious why they loved the design. It's stunning. It won't handle, though. We have to extend the wheelbase. We have to change the rake of the windshield. And the engineers apply some engineering compromises. When they're done, they hand it off to the finance people. Finance people look at it and say, oh, beautiful car, oh, and well engineered. But we can't sell it for a profit. Let's slap on the old Taurus doors, right? Let's reuse some parts. And Jobs continues and says, why do this? Right? He says at Apple, if we're coming out with a new product, we get together a cross-functional team. Why design a product that you can't engineer? Why engineer a product you can't sell at a profit? Right? Get together a cross-functional team. So we want to do that on Agile projects. But does this make everybody a generalist? Last concept I want to talk about is kind of a myth, or what I'll call a water fallacy. Right? Mistaken belief about Agile is everybody needs to be a generalist. So let's talk about this for a moment. Actually, you know what? It's getting late, so screw this. Let's talk about lunch. I'm hungry already. Say we got 3 choices of where we want to go to lunch. Let's skip the lunch here. I'm sure it's great, but let's go to one of these 3 delis I saw nearby. We've got Macconi's. It's a little Italian deli I saw nearby. They only have 1 order taker, though, but behind the counter, they've got a bunch of sandwich makers. Or we could go to our second deli choice, Bruno's. Completely different. They've got 9 people working the counter, but only 1 person in the back making the sandwiches. It's very different. Or our third choice, we could go to Ferentino's. Let's see what they have. They've got 4 people working the counter, 4 people making sandwiches, and 5 who can do both. I remember my obligatory stint as a teenager. I worked at a fast food place, and I could make the sandwiches, I could take the orders, but I couldn't replace the register tape. Right? A few of you in that situation, right? The little red stripe would start to show up on the tape. I would have to call for Nikki, my manager, who knew how to replace the register tape, right? So I wasn't the best at either job. I'm sure the people that I was at a Mexican fast food place. I was sure that the people that were back making tacos and burritos all day were faster than I was. I was pretty good at it. My burritos tasted as good as theirs, but maybe they were faster at wrapping things up. Right? So in answering the question of does everybody need to be a generalist, of course not. Right? But where would we rather go to lunch today? Right? You go to McConey's, you're going to wait forever just to get your order taken, but your sandwich will be instant afterwards. We go to Bruno's, right? It's going to actually be the opposite. Yeah. If we go to Bruno's, we're going to have no time at all. There's going to be a bunch of people to take our order, but it's going to take forever. I won't even get my sandwich till tomorrow. I'm going to go to Ferentino's where they've got this balanced out. Not everybody has to be a generalist, but a few that can do multiple jobs go a long way. So no, we don't need to take that absolutely brilliant database person, right, and make them do something else. Let them stick with the database. Have a few people that can float. It always surprises me that the sandwich shops have figured this out so easily, and yet we've struggled with it. So no, we don't need all generalists. I'm done. I want to thank everybody for their time, and have a great rest of the conference. Thank you.